It began with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy silence that follows tear gas, rubber bullets, and the sound of running feet. In the bustling streets of Nairobi, once hailed as East Africa's proud symbol of stability, elderly shopkeepers now shutter their stalls before noon. Mothers clutch their children tighter, while armored trucks idle near schoolyards. Kenya, a nation once praised for its democratic promise, now trembles under the weight of public outrage. But this story is not just about Kenya. It is about Africa's future and whether her leaders will protect it or betray it. Since June 2024, Kenya's youth have taken to the streets. What began as peaceful protests against cruel tax hikes has become a national uprising. Hundreds have been injured, dozens killed. A 12-year-old girl died in her own home, struck by a stray bullet. A young vendor was gunned down for handing out masks. A blogger died in police custody with bruises no government official could explain. But perhaps the most chilling moment came when Kenya's own president allegedly instructed police to shoot them in the legs. Break their legs. That's not law and order. That's a war against one's own people. Now, a respected African voice echoing the spirit of leaders like Captain IBRAHIM Traoré has called upon the African Union to investigate, not as a foreign intervention, but as a moral obligation to protect life, liberty, and the right to dissent. So we ask, can the African Union still protect the people it was created to serve, or has it become too comfortable in silence? You're watching a space that doesn't sensationalize Africa. We honor its truths. Please, like if you believe every child has the right to live without fear. Share if you believe bullets should never be the answer to voices of hope. And subscribe if you believe Africa must rise from within. It started with bread, or rather the tax on it. In June 2024, the Kenyan government proposed a controversial finance bill that would raise taxes on everyday essentials, bread, cooking oil, sanitary pads, even mobile money transfers. For millions of working-class families, this wasn't just another budget, it was a direct blow to survival. The message felt clear: tighten your belts, even if you have nothing left to tighten. At first, it was just murmurs. A few university students, some labor unions, civil society groups. But within weeks, those murmurs became a roar. Protesters poured into the streets of Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, cities that had long symbolized Kenya's modernity, now becoming arenas of discontent. Their chants echoed with urgency: no taxation without dignity. We are the hustler nation, don't rob us. The government responded with riot police. And then something changed. On July 7, 2025, just 1 year into the unrest, the protests reached a harrowing peak. In what many now call Kenya's Black July 31st, people were killed in a single day. A number so jarring that even the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, normally cautious, confirmed it in writing. Among the victims, a 12-year-old girl in Kiamu struck by a stray bullet while playing in her living room. Her crime, none. Her death. A tragic reminder that in a broken system, even innocence is not safe. There was Boniface Kariuki, a 22-year-old mask vendor. He wasn't marching, he wasn't shouting. He was simply present too close to the line of fire, shot at point-blank range. And then there was Albert Ojwang, a young blogger and activist. He had written about police violence, corruption, and youth unemployment. In June 2025, he was arrested. A week later, he was found dead in custody. Officials claimed it was suicide. But the autopsy told another story: head trauma, internal bruises, blunt force wounds. His family never got a proper explanation. As weeks turned into months, the protests evolved. No longer just about taxes, they became a full-throated rejection of a system that seemed to ignore its people. Youth unemployment hovered above 35%. Inflation ate away at savings. Promises made during the 2022 elections, like fighting corruption and uplifting the poor, felt like cruel jokes. The betrayal cut deep. President William Ruto, elected as the champion of the hustler nation, the working poor, the struggling young, was now being accused of turning on the very people who lifted him into office. His economic reforms, once hailed as bold, now felt detached and punitive. Meanwhile, elites prospered, contracts flowed, and foreign deals were signed behind closed doors. The public outcry was relentless. Social media became a battleground. Hashtags like Ruto must go, justice for Albert, and 7th of July massacre trended globally. TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook live-streamed clashes between unarmed youth and heavily armed police. Influencers disappeared. Nurses who treated protesters were harassed. Rumors of unmarked vans and nighttime abductions spread fear. Amid this unrest, the government made a few concessions. The finance bill was withdrawn. Some cabinet officials were reshuffled. But the trust had already been broken, and the people wanted more than policy tweaks. They wanted dignity. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice. And what they received instead, many say, was intimidation. The administration's rhetoric hardened. Rather than acknowledging the pain in the streets, leaders branded the protests as foreign-funded sabotage. Reports emerged of orders from the president himself telling security forces to shoot protesters in the legs to break their bones. It was no longer about control. It was about sending a message. By late July 2025, over 100 lives had been lost since the protests began. Thousands had been arrested. Journalists silenced, civil society threatened. The movement, however, did not die. It adapted. It spread, and most remarkably, it remained leaderless. No single political party controlled it. No opposition figure dictated its direction. It was driven by Kenya's youth, young, angry, connected, and deeply aware of their rights. Many were born after 1992 when Kenya reintroduced multi-party democracy. They had grown up believing that change was possible and were now determined to fight for it. This wasn't just another African protest, this was a generational uprising, and the world was starting to take notice. There are moments in a nation's history that split the timeline before and after. For Kenya, that moment came when its own president reportedly gave an order, shoot them in the legs, break their legs. It wasn't whispered, it wasn't misquoted, it was said on record during a press briefing with no remorse. That single sentence changed the nature of the protests. It marked a line in the sand between disagreement and brutality, between governance and authoritarianism. Until that point, the government could claim it was trying to restore order, that it used force reluctantly. But after that statement, the masks were off. Protesters, some barely out of high school, were met with live ammunition, tear gas, water cannons, and brutal beatings. Kenya's streets became battlegrounds, not between political parties, but between a young generation and the very institutions meant to protect them. Paramedics were targeted, lawyers trying to post bail were detained, churches, once sanctuaries, became makeshift clinics for the wounded. This wasn't law enforcement. This was suppression. Civil society in Kenya responded swiftly. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights released verified data exposing abuses, naming names. They confirmed that the July 7th massacre was no outlier, but part of a sustained pattern of state violence. Lawyers formed emergency legal teams. Doctors set up field hospitals. Even musicians, poets, and comedians began weaving the protest into their work, turning anger into art, trauma into testimony. And most importantly, the people refused to back down. In the face of intimidation, they adjusted. Marches turned into sit-ins. Night protests turned into candlelight vigils. Street graffiti replaced posters, silent, haunting messages that read, "We are not thugs. We are your children. We are hungry, not violent. You promised us a future. Why are you afraid of us now?" Amnesty International called it a crisis of impunity. Human Rights Watch published graphic reports including photos and testimonies of torture. The European Union urged restraint. The United Nations offered to mediate. But from the African Union, silence. The very body built to uphold African sovereignty and dignity stood frozen. No press release, no investigation, no delegation dispatched. And this silence to many felt like betrayal, because Kenya was not alone. From Sudan to Senegal, from South Africa to Ethiopia, youth-led uprisings were becoming the norm. And in each case, the cry was the same. Listen to us before it's too late. Yet the continental institutions, the ones that had sworn to protect, were treating these movements as liabilities, not lifelines. In late July 2025, a different voice emerged, not from Geneva or Washington, but from Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. A young leader often labeled a rebel or a revolutionary by the Western press, but seen as a patriot by many Africans, addressed the crisis directly. In a public speech, he did what few dared. He named the violence, condemned the silence, and challenged the African Union to act. He didn't just call for sanctions or diplomatic notes. He called for a continental investigation led by Africans rooted in African values. He proposed the creation of a youth advisory council under the AU so that movements like Kenya's would not be ignored but included. He demanded a rapid response mechanism for human rights violations so no government could hide behind sovereignty while brutalizing its own citizens. And above all, he reminded the world leadership is not about silencing dissent. It is about listening to it. What made these protests even more remarkable was their structure or lack thereof. No single leader, no political party, no external funders, just young people. They were born after 1992 after Kenya's return to multi-party democracy. They grew up online watching Tunisia, Egypt, Burkina Faso. They knew their rights. They knew their history, and now they were shaping it. They didn't want slogans. They wanted structural reform. They weren't asking to overthrow the state, they were demanding it finally serve them. And that terrified the establishment more than any army ever could. By the end of July, even silence was no longer neutral. It became a position. To stay quiet was to condone. To delay action was to fuel the fire. The protests in Kenya had ceased being about one bill, one leader, or one moment. They had become a mirror, forcing every African leader to ask, when my youth rise up, will I meet them with bullets or with listening? The price of repression is not always paid in blood. Sometimes it's paid in trust, lost a far deeper wound that takes generations to heal. For decades, Kenya prided itself as one of East Africa's most stable democracies. Its judiciary functioned. Its parliament debated. Its media thrived. But in 2025, the facade cracked. When President Ruto's administration responded to peaceful protests with batons and bullets, something intangible was broken. Citizens no longer felt protected, they felt hunted. This erosion of trust wasn't confined to Nairobi or the capital elite. It seeped into rural churches, into crowded matatus, into university lecture halls. People whispered what they used to shout, "This is not our government anymore." For many, especially the youth, the idea of engaging through elections, petitions, or civic forums felt pointless. Why vote for a system that treats you like an enemy? The result, a democratic state drifting toward disengagement and disillusionment. It wasn't just protesters who were targeted. Nurses who volunteered at protest sites were detained and questioned. Lawyers trying to file habeas corpus applications for missing youths were surveilled. Teachers were warned against discussing the unrest in classrooms. The net was cast wide, creating a chilling effect. People began deleting posts, avoiding public conversations, or even lying about their whereabouts out of fear. That fear was not paranoia, it was learned behavior. Real stories circulated of men disappearing into unmarked vans at night, of women journalists being threatened into silence, of influencers tortured for destabilizing the nation. The repression became institutional, and ordinary life school shopping prayer became politicized. The protests and their violent suppression didn't just shake people, it shook markets. Foreign investors froze deals. Tourism dipped. The Kenyan shilling weakened. Inflation soared above 12%. Unemployment among youth, already staggering at 35%, worsened as startups and informal businesses halted operations. The government, under pressure, canceled the controversial 2024 finance bill, but it was too late. The perception that it prioritized revenue over people stuck. Then came the $2 billion Adani deal scandal. The Kenyan government had secretly negotiated to hand over operational control of Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, the country's main air hub, to India's Adani Group. The deal, signed without public consultation, was only reversed after massive backlash. For many citizens, this confirmed their worst fear, that Kenya was being run for the benefit of a few, not for the many. Amid the chaos, not all institutions remained silent. A group of retired judges condemned the state's heavy-handed response, calling it a violation of Kenya's constitutional soul. Several members of parliament across party lines refused to vote on emergency policing bills, walking out in protest. Religious leaders, from Catholic bishops to Islamic scholars, held vigils for slain protesters and demanded accountability. These weren't radicals. These were elders, statesmen, moral voices. And their message was clear: this is not who we are. Ironically, the government's efforts to paint protesters as criminals, foreign agents, or tribal agitators failed. If anything, the crackdown unified Kenyans across ethnic and class lines. For the first time in years, Luo marched beside Kikuyu. Coastal Muslims stood beside Highland Christians. Urban influencers listened to rural youth. The violence created not fear, but solidarity. A young student put it simply during an interview: "We used to see ourselves as tribes. Now we see ourselves as survivors, and survivors fight together." Perhaps the most tragic consequence is how the state shut every legal pathway to reform. Peaceful protest was met with bullets. Legal appeals were buried in bureaucracy. Civil discourse was labeled subversion. By doing so, the government created a vacuum where change was no longer possible through the system, but only despite it. And in that vacuum, radicalization always finds space to grow. In the name of order, the government invited disorder. In the pursuit of control, it lost control over the very people it was sworn to serve. And in silencing dissent, it unleashed a fury that will echo for generations. The crisis in Kenya did not unfold in darkness. The world watched. From Washington to Brussels, from Geneva to London, the images were clear: unarmed youth chased down by riot police, mothers crying over the bodies of their children, entire neighborhoods blanketed in tear gas. International organizations responded quickly. Amnesty International called it a textbook case of state-sponsored brutality. Human Rights Watch documented at least 12 disappearances linked to government agents. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly called for urgent de-escalation, but statements are not action. In Washington, the U.S. State Department issued a formal note urging restraint and dialogue. But there were no sanctions, no real pressure, no public rebuke of the Kenyan president. The official position remained what it always is: Kenya is a strategic partner in East Africa. That phrase, strategic partner, has often been a shield. As long as Kenya helps with counter-terrorism in Somalia, hosts U.S. military installations, and maintains economic ties, its internal affairs are treated with delicate hands. For many Africans, this inconsistency is frustrating. How can the same Western nations that lecture Africa on democracy stay silent when one of its model democracies turns against its own people? The hypocrisy is not lost. What about the IMF and World Bank, institutions that hold enormous leverage through debt? They remained silent, too more concerned about loan conditions than human rights. Meanwhile, African diasporas in London, New York, and Paris took to the streets in solidarity. Kenyan immigrants in Minnesota organized vigils. African American leaders in Atlanta drew parallels between Kenyan protesters and the legacy of civil rights movements in the U.S. But again, those were the voices of the people, not governments. The lesson was sobering: the world will watch, but may not intervene. Not if you're poor, not if you're African, not if your tragedy disrupts profitable relationships, which is why the message from within Africa, like the one echoed by President IBRAHIM Traoré, matters so deeply. Because in the end, only Africa will save itself, not through charity, but through courage. Kenya is not alone. And what's happening there is not just a crisis, it is a mirror reflecting the tension between power and principle, between silence and responsibility. What began as a tax protest became a national awakening. What was met with violence gave birth to unity. And what the world tried to ignore has now become a litmus test for African institutions and global conscience alike. The African Union has a choice, not just about Kenya, but about its own credibility. Will it stand by while bullets silence youth? Will it treat the right to protest as a threat or as a sacred democratic expression? But this choice does not belong to the AU alone. It belongs to every African leader, every mother who lost a child, every elder who still remembers what liberation cost. It belongs to you. If we fail to act when young voices are crushed, we don't just lose a protest, we lose a generation. A generation that will grow up believing that power always wins and that truth has no champion. That is the danger. But there is hope. The young people of Kenya have already written the first chapter of a new story, one of courage, solidarity, and nonviolent defiance. What they need now is amplification, not pity. Support, not speeches. Do you believe that President Ruto's actions must be investigated by the African Union? Do you think Africa is finally ready to protect its own without waiting for foreign permission? If you've ever stood for justice, this is the moment to stand again. Please leave a comment if you believe Kenya's youth deserve to be heard. Share this video if you want others to know the truth behind the headlines. Subscribe if you believe that silence should never be the default when people cry for help, because justice delayed is justice denied. And Africa is watching. The world is watching. History is waiting. May Africa rise. May truth rise with her.